Space is an indifferent graveyard that refuses to bury its dead. When the orbital defenses of New Copenhagen shattered, 3 billion souls braced for extinction. Our distress beacons screamed into the dark, entirely unanswered. The Coalition fleet was already reduced to drifting ash. We were utterly alone, watching the enemy's bombardment cannons align to scorch our world into glass. Hope was a luxury we couldn't afford, a cruel joke in the face of annihilation. But then, the void tore open, not with calculated precision, but with the violent, howling rupture of a dying star. Hell had arrived. The subterranean command bunker of Outpost Echo vibrated violently, shedding centuries-old dust from its reinforced concrete ceiling. Commander James Fitzpatrick gripped the edge of the central holodable, his knuckles white, his jaw set so hard his teeth ached. The tactical display before him was a chaotic swirl of hostile crimson icons suffocating the few remaining flickers of Allied blue. "Shield integrity at 14%, Commander," shouted Lieutenant Jessica Bowman, her voice barely cutting through the klaxons blaring across the room. She was frantically rerouting power through the battered Lockheed Martin Aegis, 7 command consoles, her fingers a blur over the haptic interfaces. The southern hemisphere grid is collapsing. We've lost the orbital tether, and the atmospheric scrubbers are failing. Fitzpatrick didn't reply immediately. He simply watched the holographic projection as another blue icon, the heavy cruiser Aegis, commanded by his old friend Thomas Reed, blinked out of existence. It didn't fade. It was violently snuffed out, replaced by an expanding sphere of debris and radiation. They were fighting the Blackwood Consortium, originally a megacorporation that had monopolized interstellar resource extraction. Blackwood had seceded from the United Earth Directorate a decade ago, transforming its massive industrial fleets into a ruthless, highly disciplined armada. Admiral Stefan Ward, the architect of this slaughter, didn't want to conquer New Copenhagen. He wanted to make an example of it. Reroute whatever civilian reactor power we have left to the Northrop Grumman point defense arrays, Fitzpatrick ordered, his voice surprisingly calm despite the cold sweat trickling down his spine. Tell the ground batteries to focus on their capital ships. If we're going down, we're taking their paint jobs with us. Sir, Bowman swallowed hard, pulling up a secondary display. The ground batteries are gone. Blackwood dreadnoughts just executed a localized kinetic strike on Sector 4. Millions of tons of tungsten just hit the crust. Seismic shockwaves are tearing the capital apart. Fitzpatrick closed his eyes. His wife, Chloe, and his daughter were in Sector 4. They had been in the deep shelters, but a kinetic bombardment of that magnitude wouldn't leave a single molecule intact. The grief was a physical weight, a crushing blow to his chest, but he forced it down into a dark, locked box in his mind. He was a commander first. He had an obligation to the people still breathing in the bunker. Time until orbital bombardment cannons are fully aligned on our coordinates? He asked, staring blankly at the red swarm. 4 minutes, muttered Ensign Bradley Mitchell from the sensor station. The young man looked like he was about to vomit. They're taking their time. Admiral Ward's flagship, the Leviathan, has positioned itself in low orbit. They are overriding our local comms networks. Suddenly, the main view screen flickered. The tactical map vanished, replaced by the crisp, sterile bridge of the Leviathan. Admiral Stefan Ward sat in his command chair, looking impeccably tailored in a charcoal gray uniform. He was sipping from a crystal glass, entirely unbothered by the genocide he was orchestrating. Commander Fitzpatrick, Ward's voice purred through the bunker's audio system, laced with artificial static. I admire your tenacity. The United Earth Directorate always did breed stubborn dogs. But the time for heroics has passed. You have 3 minutes before I glass this continent. I am offering you the chance to transmit a message to Earth. Tell them what happens when you defy the consortium. Go to hell, Ward, Fitzpatrick said, leaning into the pickup microphone. Ward smiled thinly. I am already there, Commander, and I am bringing the fire out. The screen snapped back to the tactical map. The countdown timer in the corner of the holographic display felt like a guillotine slowly descending. 3 minutes. 180 seconds until the bunker and everyone in it was vaporized. "Send a final burst transmission to Earth Command," Fitzpatrick said softly, looking around the room. He met the eyes of his officers. Bowman, Mitchell, Chief Engineer Olivia Henderson. They were young, terrified, and far too brave. "Tell them New Copenhagen held the line until the end. Tell them no aid was expected and none arrived." Henderson let out a shaky breath, wiping soot from her forehead. Transmission sent, "Commander, God help us." They waited. The bunker continued to shudder as secondary strikes rained down on the surface above. The silence in the command center was deafening, broken only by the hum of failing servers and the ragged breathing of the crew. They had fought for 6 months. They had exhausted their fleets, emptied their munitions, and sacrificed millions. It was all over. At 2 minutes to annihilation, the atmosphere in the bunker shifted. It wasn't a tactical change, but a palpable shift in the air pressure. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the deck plating, something that bypassed the ears and rattled directly against the bones. Ensign Mitchell, Fitzpatrick frowned, gripping the console. What was that, a seismic aftershock? Mitchell blinked, his hands flying across his keyboard, his brow furrowed in confusion. "No, sir. It's not seismic. It's atmospheric? No, that's not right either. I'm getting interference on the Raytheon subspace scanners. Massive interference." "Blackwood electronic warfare?" Bowman asked, her voice tight. "Are they jamming us before the strike?" "It doesn't match Blackwood's signatures," Mitchell said, his voice rising in pitch. The holographic display above him began to glitch, tearing into static shapes before resolving into a massive, swirling vortex of data. "Sir, I am detecting a localized gravity well opening just outside the planet's exosphere. It's right in the middle of the Blackwood Fleet formation." Fitzpatrick walked over to Mitchell's station. "A jump point? Is it a Directorate relief fleet?" "It can't be," Henderson interjected from the engineering console. "Standard General Dynamics warp cores take hours to spool up a gravity well of that size, and we would have detected the tachyon emissions days ago. This is tearing open instantly. It's completely violating the Eddington limits of subspace mechanics." The hum grew louder, evolving into a screech that forced several officers to cover their ears. It was a terrifying, tearing sound, as if the fabric of the universe itself was being ripped apart by brute force. On the tactical map, the red icons of the Blackwood fleet began to scatter. They were reacting to the anomaly. Admiral Ward's perfectly aligned bombardment formation broke apart as ships desperately tried to maneuver away from the sudden, massive gravitational distortion blooming in their center. "Visual," Fitzpatrick barked. "Get me a visual on that anomaly right now." The main screen shifted from the tactical map to a feed from one of the few surviving orbital stealth satellites. Space itself was bleeding. A massive, jagged tear in the void had appeared, glowing with a sickly, bruised purple light. It wasn't the clean, spherical distortion of a standard slip-space jump. It looked like a wound. Cherenkov radiation spiked so hard, it temporarily blinded the satellite's optical sensors, washing the screen in blinding white. When the glare faded, the anomaly was still there, violently venting plasma and exotic matter into the vacuum. "They're not just jumping in," Mitchell whispered in absolute horror, watching the telemetry data scroll past at lighting speed. "They are literally shredding the dimensional barrier. Sir, whatever is coming through that hole, it isn't slowing down, it's accelerating." "Accelerating? Inside a transition tunnel?" Henderson gasped. "That's suicide. The sheer kinetic friction of re-entering normal space at that velocity will vaporize the ship." "Somebody is in a hurry," Fitzpatrick murmured, his eyes glued to the screen. The Blackwood Consortium was not idle. Admiral Ward, realizing the threat, ordered his surrounding cruisers to open fire on the anomaly. Hundreds of plasma torpedoes and railgun slugs streaked toward the purple rift, attempting to destroy whatever was trying to breach through before it could materialize. The munitions hit the distortion field and simply vanished, swallowed by the sheer gravitational density of the rift. Then, the howling began. It didn't come through the comms speakers. It came through everything. Every piece of metal in the bunker, every bulkhead, every rifle barrel began to resonate with a deafening, terrifying acoustic scream. It was a digital broadcast forced onto every frequency, a terrifying, aggressive roar that sounded like a predator announcing its arrival to the prey. "I'm losing the feed," Bowman yelled over the noise. "The sheer radiation output is frying our satellite. Keep it online," Fitzpatrick ordered. On the screen, the purple wound in space widened one final time, violently exhaling a massive wave of displaced energy that slammed into the nearest Blackwood cruisers, spinning them out of control like toys in a hurricane. And then, the prow of a ship breached the anomaly. It was pitch black, angular, and absolutely massive. It didn't have the sleek aerodynamic lines of modern Directorate vessels, nor the bulky industrial blockiness of the Blackwood fleet. It looked like a brutalist spearhead forged in the darkest pits of hell. The hull was scarred, heavily armored, and completely devoid of any running lights or transponder signals. Vessel identified. "Wait, that can't be right," Mitchell stammered, staring at his screen in disbelief. "What is it, Ensign?" Fitzpatrick demanded. Mitchell looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide. "The transponder code is ancient, sir. It's pre-secession. It's the UES Vengeance." The room went dead silent, the howling acoustic broadcast suddenly cutting off. "That's impossible," Bowman breathed. The Vengeance was a black site experimental dreadnought. It was declared lost in the Orion Nebula over 40 years ago. "It's a ghost ship." "Well," Fitzpatrick said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face as he looked at the monolithic titan on the screen. "It seems the ghost just found its way home." The UES Vengeance did not pause to assess the battlefield. It did not attempt to hail the enemy or demand surrender. It had come howling from the void with a singular, terrifying purpose, and it executed that purpose the millisecond its massive engines cleared the slipspace rift. Captain Richard Hayes stood on the bridge of the Vengeance, his hands clasped behind his back. The bridge was dark, lit only by the blood-red glow of the tactical displays and the ambient light of the stars outside the reinforced viewport. Hayes was a man out of time, a relic of a bygone era of total war, preserved in stasis alongside his crew until the fail-safe protocols of his ship woke them to the sound of Earth's distress frequencies. "Main drives to maximum output," Hayes ordered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried absolute authority. "Do not bleed off our re-entry velocity. I want us to hit their line like a kinetic slug." "Aye, Captain," responded his helmsman, a stoic veteran named Carter. "Drives at 120%. We are redlining the Boeing Stellar fusion cores." "Let them burn," Hayes said coldly. "We've slept for 40 years. It's time to wake up. Tactical, give me a firing solution on the nearest hostile capital ship. Target locked. Blackwood Heavy Cruiser, designated Ironclad." The tactical officer, Lieutenant Reed, reported. "Distance, 40,000 kilometers and closing rapidly. Open the forward silos. Deplete the entire first tier of nuclear ordnance. Follow up with the dual spinal railguns. Outside, the sheer mass of the Vengeance was already causing chaos. By refusing to decelerate after jumping, the massive dreadnought was essentially acting as an unstoppable battering ram. The Blackwood cruiser Ironclad attempted to turn, its automated defense turrets tracking the approaching behemoth, but it was far too slow. Before the Ironclad could even fire its main batteries, the Vengeance unleashed hell. 50 heavily modified, stealth-coated nuclear missiles erupted from the forward tubes of the human dreadnought. They didn't fly in a standard swarm. They moved with terrifying erratic precision, dodging point defense lasers, using advanced, unpredictable micro-thruster burns. The Blackwood cruiser managed to shoot down 12. The remaining 38 slammed into its port side. In the command bunker on New Copenhagen, Fitzpatrick and his crew watched the monitors in stunned silence. There was no prolonged battle, No trading of blows. The Ironclad, a ship that had terrorized their colony for months, simply ceased to exist in a blinding chain reaction of nuclear fire. The shockwave of the explosion rippled through the vacuum, disrupting the shields of nearby enemy vessels. "Good God," Mitchell whispered. "They just obliterated a capital ship in a single volley." "They're not slowing down," Bowman yelled, pointing at the telemetry data. On the screen, the Vengeance flew straight through the expanding cloud of radioactive debris that used to be the Ironclad. The friction of the debris striking the Dreadnought's advanced void shields caused the entire ship to glow with a terrifying ethereal blue aura. "Helm, adjust heading by 3 degrees. Aim for the center of their command formation," Hayes ordered on the bridge of the Vengeance. "Let's introduce them to our gravity tether." The Vengeance was not just a warship. It was a mobile weapons platform for experimental tech that the UED had deemed too dangerous to mass produce. As the Dreadnought barreled into the heart of the Blackwood fleet, 4 massive prongs extending from its bow began to hum with devastating power. "Activate the tether," Hayes commanded. A pulse of distorted gravity, invisible but utterly destructive, shot outward from the Vengeance. It hit a cluster of 3 Blackwood destroyers. Instantly, the navigational computers of the enemy ships shrieked in panic. The artificial gravity within the ships inverted and amplified violently. The crews inside were crushed against the bulkheads, and the sheer structural stress caused the hulls of the destroyers to implode inward, crumpling like crushed soda cans before they detonated. Admiral Stephen Ward watched the massacre from the bridge of the Leviathan. His calm, aristocratic demeanor had entirely vanished, replaced by a mask of primal panic. The ghost ship was dismantling his armada with a brutality he had never witnessed. "Concentrate all fire!" Ward screamed at his officers. "Bring the bombardment cannons offline and target that dreadnought. Hit it with everything we have." The entire surviving Blackwood fleet, over 40 ships, turned their weapons onto the Vengeance. The darkness of space was suddenly illuminated by thousands of plasma streams, laser lances, and railgun slugs converging on a single point. The Vengeance took the hit. The sheer volume of fire was staggering. The Dreadnought's void shields flared violently, transitioning from blue to a dangerous, angry red. In the bunker, Fitzpatrick held his breath. Their shields are buckling. They can't take concentrated fire from an entire fleet. But Captain Hayes didn't flinch. As the bridge shook violently under the bombardment, he simply smiled. It was a cold, wolfish smile. "They've clustered up," Hayes noted calmly. "Divert all secondary power from life support and thrusters to the portside broadside batteries. Load the shrapnel canisters." "Broadsides loaded and locked," Reed confirmed, bracing himself against his console. "Roll the ship 90 degrees, Hayes ordered. "Show them our teeth." The massive dreadnought, despite its size, executed a brutal, thruster-heavy roll, exposing its massive port side to the clustered Blackwood fleet. The side of the Vengeance wasn't smooth. It was lined with hundreds of massive physical gun ports, a terrifying callback to naval warfare of centuries past, modernized with magnetic accelerator technology. "Fire," Hayes whispered. Hundreds of cannons detonated simultaneously. The recoil was so massive, it physically pushed the entire dreadnought sideways. They didn't fire plasma or lasers. They fired dense, house-sized canisters filled with millions of jagged, depleted uranium shards. As the canisters traveled halfway to the enemy fleet, they exploded. Space itself became a meat grinder. A tidal wave of hypervelocity shrapnel tore into the Blackwood formation. It shredded through point defense systems, ripped solar arrays to ribbons, and mercilessly perforated the heavily armored hulls of the enemy cruisers. The vacuum of space was suddenly filled with venting atmosphere, screaming metal, and the silent detonations of a dozen Blackwood ships suffering catastrophic reactor breaches simultaneously. Admiral Ward's fleet was broken in a matter of seconds. They just gutted them, Bowman stammered in the command bunker, tears of sheer disbelief streaming down her face. The Blackwood fleet is in full retreat. The Leviathan is powering up its warp drive. We are tracking Admiral Ward's flagship. Captain, Lieutenant Reed reported on the Vengeance. They are attempting a slip space jump. Hayes narrowed his eyes. Not on my watch. Spool up the spinal magnetic accelerators. Target their warp drive nacelles. I want them crippled, not destroyed. We have questions for whoever is leading this rabble. The massive twin railguns running the entire length of the Vengeance whined as they drew power directly from the main reactor. Firing, Reed said. 2 slugs of pure, dense osmium, accelerating to a fraction of the speed of light, crossed the void in an instant. They punched straight through the kinetic barriers of the Leviathan, shearing off both of its massive warp nacelles in a brilliant flash of secondary explosions. The Blackwood flagship was instantly dead in the water, adrift and entirely at the mercy of the Howling ghost ship that had just annihilated its armada. Silence descended upon the orbital space of New Copenhagen. Where there was once a terrifying armada poised to burn a world, there was now only drifting wreckage, silent debris, and the monolithic silhouette of the UES Vengeance. In the command bunker, Commander Fitzpatrick slowly exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for an eternity. He looked at the main screen, at the terrifying, beautiful human dreadnought hovering above his world. "Open a hailing frequency," Fitzpatrick said, his voice thick with emotion. "Wide beam." Bowman nodded, her hands shaking as she opened the channel. "Unknown Directorate vessel. This is Commander James Fitzpatrick of Outpost Echo, New Copenhagen," he broadcasted, his voice echoing in the silent bunker. We did not expect aid. I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you just saved 3 billion lives. We are heavily damaged and require immediate assistance." For a long moment, there was only static. Then, a low, gravelly voice cut through the comms. "Outpost Echo, this is Captain Richard Hayes of the UES Vengeance," the voice responded, tired but resolute. "We heard your distress call. We may be late, Commander, but humanity does not abandon its own. Stand down your remaining defenses. We have the watch." Fitzpatrick slumped against the holodable, burying his face in his hands as a ragged cheer finally erupted from the surviving crew in the bunker. They were alive. Against all odds, against the terrifying mathematics of a siege, they had survived. Space was a graveyard, yes. But today, the dead had refused to stay buried, and they had brought a reckoning with them. The descent from orbit was not the triumphant parade of a victorious fleet, but a grim survey of a world barely clinging to life. Commander James Fitzpatrick sat in the troop compartment of a heavily armored, modified Sikorsky-Boeing dropship, staring out the scratched plasteel viewport. Below him, the capital city of New Copenhagen was a smoking, cratered ruin. The dust in the atmosphere was so thick, it turned the sunlight into a bruised, bloody crimson. Caterpillar heavy-duty autonomous earth movers, usually reserved for asteroid mining, were already clawing through the rubble of Sector 4, searching for survivors amidst the catastrophic kinetic strikes. Beside him sat Lieutenant Jessica Bowman and Chief Engineer Olivia Henderson. They were exhausted, covered in the grim grime of a command bunker that had nearly become their tomb. "We are approaching the UES Vengeance, Commander," the dropship pilot announced over the intercom. Fitzpatrick leaned forward. As the dropship broke through the upper cloud layer, the sheer scale of the dreadnought became fully apparent. It hung in low orbit like a steel mountain, a brutalist monolith of dark, radar-absorbent plating and massive, scarred weapon emplacements. It possessed none of the elegant, sweeping curves of the modern United Earth Directorate ships. It was an ugly, terrifying instrument of war, engineered in an era when humanity believed its survival depended entirely on overwhelming, unapologetic violence. The dropship clamped onto the dreadnought's primary starboard airlock with a heavy, metallic thud. When the pressure doors hissed open, they were not greeted by a ceremonial honor guard. Instead, 2 heavily armed Marines clad in bulky, pressurized combat armor designs that looked like they belonged in a museum of the 22nd century waited for them. Their assault rifles, thick and blocky, lacked the sleek plasma coils of modern weaponry, relying instead on high-velocity, caseless ammunition. "Commander Fitzpatrick," the lead Marine said, his voice modulated through his helmet. "Captain Hayes is expecting you in the brig. Follow us." The interior of the Vengeance was chilling. It was utilitarian to the point of being hostile. Exposed cabling, harsh tungsten lighting, and the ever-present, bone-rattling hum of the massive Boeing Stellar fusion cores running at maximum output. There were no recreational decks, no botanical gardens for crew morale. It was a submarine in space, built solely for killing. They were led down several heavily armored corridors until they reached the detention level. Captain Richard Hayes stood outside a reinforced holding cell. Up close, Hayes looked exactly like his ship, hard, uncompromising, and deeply scarred. His dark hair was peppered with gray, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen the abyss and decided to shoot it in the face. "Commander," Hayes said, extending a calloused hand. "Captain Hayes," Fitzpatrick replied, shaking it firmly. "I don't have the words to thank you. You pulled us back from the brink. But the history book said the Vengeance was lost with all hands 40 years ago." Hayes offered a grim, humorless smile. "History books are written by politicians, Commander. The Directorate didn't lose us. They buried us. We were a black site project, a joint venture between DARPA and BAE Systems. We were built to be the Directorate's ultimate failsafe, armed with weaponry deemed too inhumane by the Geneva Accords. When the politicians signed their peace treaties, we became an embarrassment. So, they put us in deep stasis in the Orion Nebula under standing orders to wake only if a Directorate colony broadcasted an Omega-level extinction signal." Fitzpatrick felt a chill run down his spine. "Earth Command abandoned us. They didn't send a fleet. Your ship woke up automatically." "Earth Command is weak," Hayes said coldly. "They grew complacent. But that is a conversation for later. Right now, we have a guest who owes us some answers." Hayes pressed a control on the bulkhead, and the one-way mirror of the holding cell cleared. Inside, strapped to a harsh metal chair, was Admiral Stephen Ward. His pristine charcoal-gray uniform was scorched and torn. The aristocratic arrogance he had displayed on the bunker's view screen was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization of his own mortality. Fitzpatrick stepped into the cell, Hayes right behind him. "Admiral," Fitzpatrick said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You slaughtered 3 billion people. You glassed my cities. Why? The Blackwood Consortium is an industrial conglomerate. Why burn the infrastructure you supposedly seceded to conquer?" Ward coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the steel floor. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically between Fitzpatrick and the imposing figure of Captain Hayes. "You think this was about conquest?" Ward laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "You think we wanted to rule over this miserable rock? You fools. You blind, pathetic fools." Hayes stepped forward, grabbing Ward by the collar and hoisting him up. "Start making sense, Ward, or I will feed you to the starboard airlock piece by piece. We seceded because Earth Command refused to look into the dark." Ward screamed, panic finally breaking through his facade. 10 years ago, a Blackwood deep space mining fleet was mapping the Perseus Arm. We were looking for heavy metals. We found a graveyard, thousands of dead ships, alien ships, pulverized, and we found what killed them. Henderson, who had been silently recording the interrogation on her datapad, stepped forward. "What did you find?" "A machine intellect," Ward whispered, shivering despite the heat of the room. "An automated extermination protocol left behind by a civilization that died 1 million years ago. We called them the Harvesters. They sleep in the deep dark, waking only when a civilization reaches a certain threshold of subspace noise. Earth is making too much noise. They are coming." Fitzpatrick stared at him. "You expect us to believe that you slaughtered our world to save us from aliens?" "No," Ward snapped. "We realized Earth Command wouldn't believe us. They would form committees. They would try to negotiate with an enemy that only understands mathematics and genocide. The Blackwood Consortium militarized to survive. We needed resources. We needed shipyards, fuel, and raw materials to build a fleet capable of defending our core worlds. New Copenhagen was just a resource node. We were purging the population to automate your factories. We were trying to build a wall. Hayes dropped Ward back into the chair. The silence in the cell was heavy, suffocating. "A wall of corpses," Hayes said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "You thought you could outmonster the dark, Ward." "We did what had to be done," Ward yelled. "And what did you do? You destroyed my fleet. You just crippled humanity's only defense. The Harvesters are less than 6 months away from the Outer Rim. You haven't saved New Copenhagen, Captain. You've just ensured we will all burn together." The revelation hit the command crew like a physical blow. Fitzpatrick walked out of the brig, his mind reeling. Millions dead on New Copenhagen, not out of political malice, but out of a psychotic, desperate attempt at preparation by a rogue corporation. They gathered in the Vengeance's tactical briefing room. It was a stark space dominated by a massive, central holographic projector running on an archaic but incredibly secure Palantir operating system. "Can we verify anything he just said?" Fitzpatrick asked, leaning heavily against the table. Lieutenant Reed, Hayes' tactical officer, nodded grimly. "We decrypted the navigational databanks from the wreckage of the Leviathan. Ward wasn't lying about their deep space telemetry. We found petabytes of sensor logs from the Perseus arm. Chief Henderson and I have been running the data through our analytics engines." Reed tapped the console. The projector flared to life, displaying a star map of a distant sector. It zoomed in on a dense cluster of dead, frozen worlds. "This is designated Sector 44X, Ray," Reed explained. Blackwood mining probes detected massive energy signatures beneath the ice of several rogue planets. When they drilled down, they didn't find ore. They found shipyards. The holographic image shifted, displaying grainy, terrifying footage retrieved from a destroyed Blackwood drone. Beneath the ice, suspended in vast subterranean caverns, were geometric shapes of terrifying scale. They were jagged, obsidian-black constructs, covered in glowing, sickly green circuitry. They didn't look like ships. They looked like predatory insects scaled up to the size of dreadnoughts. "The Harvesters," Henderson breathed, her eyes wide with horror. "Look at the power output on those things. They don't use standard fusion or antimatter. The telemetry suggests they are tapping directly into zero-point energy fields. That's technologically impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Chief," Captain Hayes said, walking into the light of the hologram. "Only undiscovered." Ward was right about one thing. Earth Command would have debated this until the sky caught fire. They are bureaucrats playing at being soldiers. Fitzpatrick looked at Hayes. "Captain, your ship is powerful, but if there are thousands of those things out there, the Vengeance alone isn't enough." Hayes looked at the projection, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the deep, rhythmic hum of the Dreadnought's engines. When Project Tartarus was commissioned, Hayes began, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a dying star. The Directorate didn't just build one ship. The Vengeance was the prototype. We were sent to the Orion Nebula to guard a black site facility, a shipyard hidden inside the radiation clouds of a pulsar. Fitzpatrick's head snapped up. "A shipyard? The Directorate built a fleet," Hayes confirmed. "An entire armada of Tartarus-class dreadnoughts, heavy cruisers, and automated defense platforms. They built them in secret, realizing the public would never tolerate the existence of weapons that violate every ethical code of warfare. But before the fleet could be fully crewed, the political climate on Earth shifted. The Doves took power. They mothballed the entire project. They ordered me to place my crew in stasis, shut down the facility, and wait." "So the fleet is still there," Bowman said, a spark of desperate hope igniting in her chest. "In the Orion Nebula." "Yes," Hayes said. "Intact, fully fueled, loaded with ordnance that makes the bombardment of New Copenhagen look like a fireworks display. But they are empty, ghost ships waiting for a crew." Fitzpatrick's mind raced. He looked at his surviving officers. New Copenhagen's planetary defense forces had been decimated, but they still had thousands of highly trained orbital drop-shock troopers, Navy pilots, and gunnery crews who had survived the siege in the deep bunkers. They were currently sitting on a ruined world, waiting to starve. "We have the crews," Fitzpatrick said, his voice hardening into steel. Hayes turned to look at him, a slow, approving nod acknowledging the commander's resolve. "I was hoping you would say that, Commander. The harvesters are coming to reap humanity. But they are making a critical miscalculation. They assume we are prey." "What's the play, Captain?" Fitzpatrick asked. "We don't wait for them to breach the outer rim," Hayes said, slamming his fist onto the holotable. "We take the Vengeance to the Orion Nebula. We wake up the Tartarus fleet. And then, we jump straight down the throat of the Harvesters' staging ground in the Perseus Arm. We don't build a wall. We burn their house down." The next 48 hours were a blur of frenetic, desperate activity. The surviving population of New Copenhagen was mobilized. It wasn't an evacuation. It was a mass conscription driven by the terrifying clarity of extinction. Using the massive cargo bays of the Vengeance and a handful of repaired Blackwood heavy lifters, over 50,000 Directorate military personnel were ferried into orbit. They were battered, exhausted, and traumatized by the loss of their home, but as they stepped aboard the dark, brooding corridors of the ancient dreadnought, their despair calcified into a cold, unbreakable rage. Lieutenant Bowman coordinated the logistics, working closely with the Vengeance's quartermaster, a terrifyingly efficient officer named Sergeant Cole. They stripped the planetary armories bare, loading millions of rounds of ammunition, medical supplies, and M44 heavy combat exosuits into the ship's holds. Chief Engineer Henderson spent her time in the Dreadnought's engineering bay, working with the ship's AI to optimize the massive slip space drives for the jump to Orion. The Vengeance was a beast, and its technology was dangerously aggressive. She found herself disabling safety limiters that modern Directorate engineers would consider suicidal. Chief, Ensign Mitchell, called out from a secondary diagnostics terminal. He looked exhausted, subsisting entirely on military-grade StimCaf. "I'm looking at the targeting algorithms for the Tartarus-class ships we're supposed to wake up. Sir, these aren't defensive protocols." Henderson wiped grease from her cheek and walked over. "What do you mean?" "Modern Directorate targeting systems prioritize disabling enemy propulsion and weapons," Mitchell explained, bringing up lines of archaic code. "These systems, they prioritize total structural annihilation. There are subroutines here designed to inject localized singularities into planetary cores. This isn't a fleet built to fight a war, Chief. It's a fleet built to exterminate a species." Henderson stared at the screen, the cold reality of what they were unleashing settling heavily on her shoulders. Captain Hayes said they were built for the dark. Let's just pray we can keep them pointed at the harvesters. On the bridge, Fitzpatrick stood beside Captain Hayes. The massive viewport showed the ruined, dust-choked sphere of New Copenhagen. It was a graveyard now, a monument to Blackwood's hubris and humanity's vulnerability. "We are loaded, Captain," Fitzpatrick reported. "All surviving military personnel are aboard and secured for slip space transition. The civilian survivors have been moved to the deep bunkers with enough supplies to last 2 years. We left them the planetary shield generators." "It will have to be enough," Hayes said, his eyes fixed on the stars. "Helm, set coordinates for the Orion Nebula. Grid reference Tartarus Actual." "Coordinates locked, Captain," Helmsman Carter replied. Spooling up the Boeing stellar drives. "Warning, gravitational shear is exceeding standard parameters." "Ignore the warnings, Carter. We don't have time for a gentle ride," Hayes ordered. "Tactical. Keep a sensor lock on the deep space relays. Let me know if the harvesters twitch." "Aye, Captain," Reed said. In the brig, Admiral Stephen Ward sat in darkness, listening to the agonizing scream of the ship's slipspace drives powering up. He knew what they were doing. He knew they were going after the Ghost Fleet. A part of him, the arrogant corporate aristocrat, believed they were rushing to their deaths. But another part of him, the part that had watched the Vengeance rip his invincible armada to shreds, felt a terrifying glimmer of hope. "You're unleashing demons," Ward whispered to the empty cell. "God help us all." "Transition in 3, 2, 1, Carter announced on the bridge. Breaching. Space outside the viewport didn't just warp, it shattered. The Vengeance tore a hole in the fabric of reality with brute, unapologetic force, plunging into the chaotic, swirling nightmare of the slipstream. The dreadnought groaned, its massive titanium alloy bulkhead screaming under the immense dimensional pressure. Inside the troop bays, 50,000 soldiers held on in silence. There was no cheering, no patriotic bravado. They were the ghosts of a dead world, riding in the belly of a ghost ship, heading into the darkest corners of the galaxy to fight an enemy that wanted to erase them from existence. "Status?" Hayes demanded over the roar of the transition tunnel. "Holding together, Captain," Henderson's voice crackled over the comms from engineering. "We are riding the edge of the thermal limit, but the reactor is stable. Estimated time to the Orion Nebula is 12 hours, Carter reported. "We are moving faster than any Directorate ship on record." Fitzpatrick looked at Hayes. The older man stood perfectly still, balancing against the violent shuddering of the deck as if he had been born in the chaos of the slipstream. "When we get there, Captain," Fitzpatrick said, "how do we wake them up? If they've been on ice for 40 years, the automated defenses of the black site will likely target us." "They won't target us," Hayes said softly, reaching inside his uniform jacket. He pulled out a heavy physical key, forged from a dark, unidentifiable metal. It hummed slightly, glowing with a faint, internal crimson light. "I hold the master cipher. I am the commander of the Tartarus fleet. When we exit slipspace, the facility will recognize my biometric signature." Hayes looked at the key, the weight of his long exile finally showing in the lines of his face. "For 40 years, I slept in the dark, Commander," Hayes said, his voice barely audible over the roaring engines. "I watched my era pass away. I watched the Directorate soften, dismantle its armor, and forget the monsters that lurk in the void. They thought they could legislate peace." He turned to Fitzpatrick, his eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying fire. "But the universe doesn't care about treaties, Fitzpatrick. It only respects force. The Harvesters are about to learn that they are not the apex predators of this galaxy. Humanity is." The Vengeance howled through the dimension rift, a spear of vengeance aimed directly at the heart of the Orion Nebula. The dead had refused to stay buried, and they were bringing an army with them. The true war was about to begin, and no aid was expected, because they were the aid. They were the reckoning. The transition out of slipspace was not a deceleration. It was a violent, teeth-rattling collision with normal space. The UES Vengeance ripped its way back into the physical universe, its massive hull shedding exotic matter and thermal radiation like a beast rising from a boiling sea. Outside the viewport, the universe was on fire. They had emerged deep within the Orion Nebula, directly inside the accretion disk of a violently spinning pulsar. The ambient radiation was so intense that the Dreadnought's primary optical sensors immediately fused, forcing the ship to rely entirely on synthesized Lockheed Martin LiDAR arrays. Swaths of blinding violet and bruised indigo gas swirled around them, illuminated by the rhythmic, strobe-like death flashes of the dying star. "Shield integrity is fluctuating, Captain," Chief Engineer Olivia Henderson yelled over the internal comms, her voice tight with panic. "The sheer magnetic shear from the pulsar is tearing at our void plating. We can't stay in this soup for long. The Boeing Stellar reactors are already running at 110% just to keep the hull from turning to slag." "Hold steady, Chief," Captain Richard Hayes commanded, his eyes fixed on the chaotic LiDAR readout. "Helm, bring us to bearing 049er. Take us into the dust clouds." "Captain," Lieutenant Reed interrupted, his hands flying across the tactical console. "I'm detecting massive power spikes directly ahead. Not the pulsar, it's localized. Sir, we are being painted by targeting lasers. Hundreds of them." Commander James Fitzpatrick stepped up to the console, staring at the sudden bloom of red threat indicators. Hidden within the thickest, most radioactive bands of the nebula, a massive superstructure began to resolve on the sensors. It was a shipyard, but not like any commercial General Dynamics dock. It was a fortress of jagged iron and reinforced titanium, tethered to the gravitational dead zones of the surrounding asteroid field. Bristling across its surface were automated orbital defense platforms, their massive railguns slowly turning to track the Vengeance. "They have a firing solution," Reed warned, the klaxons on the bridge screaming a collision and lock-on warning simultaneously. "Automated protocols are active. They don't recognize our transponder." "Because this facility doesn't answer to transponders," Hayes said. He stepped forward to the Central Command dais and inserted the heavy, glowing cipher key he had revealed earlier into a hidden port beneath the primary holotable. He twisted it 90 degrees and slammed his palm onto a biometric scanner. "Broadcast the Tartarus override on all frequencies," Hayes ordered. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The massive defense platforms continued to charge, the electromagnetic whine of their capacitors audible even through the vacuum of space and the thick hull of the dreadnought. Fitzpatrick braced himself, waiting for the impact that would vaporize them. Then, the klaxons stopped. The red threat indicators on the holotable flickered, turning a cool, allied blue. "Override accepted," Reed breathed, wiping a bead of sweat from his chin. "Captain, the shipyard is powering up." As the Vengeance drifted closer, the dust clouds parted, pushed back by the sudden ignition of thousands of localized gravity tethers. The dark, silent fortress began to glow with internal power. And tethered to the massive docking pylons was the Ghost Fleet. Fitzpatrick gasped. There were easily over 200 vessels, but they were not standard cruisers or destroyers. They were monsters. Tartarus-class heavy dreadnoughts, siege carriers, and specialized electronic warfare frigates. They shared the brutal, unpainted, radar-absorbent aesthetic of the Vengeance. They were heavily armored wedges of destruction, their hulls practically bristling with spinal railguns, physical torpedo tubes, and the terrifying pronged emitters of gravity tether weapons. "Project Tartarus," Hayes whispered, a dark reverence in his voice. The Directorate built them, looked at what they had created, and terrified themselves. So they buried them here. "Well?" Fitzpatrick said, his voice hardening as he looked at the sleeping armada. "The dead are clocking in." The logistics of waking the fleet were a nightmare, but the survivors of New Copenhagen were fueled by a rage that defied exhaustion. 50,000 planetary defense troops, Navy pilots, and conscripted engineers were ferried across the radioactive void in heavily shielded dropships. Fitzpatrick found himself assigned to a Tartarus-class heavy cruiser designated the Acheron. When he and his bridge crew, including Lieutenant Jessica Bowman, stepped aboard, the ship felt like a tomb. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and preservation chemicals. But as Bowman initiated the cold start sequences on the archaic but brutally efficient command consoles, the Acheron hummed to life. Down in the brig of the Vengeance, Admiral Stephen Ward watched the telemetry feeds on a small monitor Hayes had mercifully left him. As the Ghost Fleet lit up, ship by ship, the Blackwood commander curled his hands into fists. "You don't understand what those ships are designed to do," Ward whispered to the empty room, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "They don't have peacetime limiters. They don't have surrender protocols. You aren't waking up a fleet, Hayes. You're unchaining a rabid dog." 12 hours later, the Tartarus fleet broke from the docking pylons. 200 heavily armed, nuclear-capable dreadnoughts formed a massive spearhead formation behind the Vengeance. The ghosts of New Copenhagen had found their armor. "All vessels report combat ready," Reed announced on the flagship's bridge. Hayes stood at the viewport, watching the armada fall into line. "Helm, spool up the fleet-wide slipspace array. Set coordinates for Sector 44 X-ray. The Perseus arm. Spooling drives, Captain," Carter confirmed. "Let's go hunt some monsters," Hayes said. The Perseus arm of the galaxy was a cold, desolate expanse, largely ignored by Directorate colonization efforts due to its lack of habitable worlds and the treacherous density of its rogue asteroid clusters. Sector 4, 4X. Ray was exactly as Admiral Ward had described it, a graveyard system of frozen rogue planets drifting aimlessly without a host star. When the slipspace rupture tore open the void, it didn't just deposit the human fleet, it announced their arrival with a gravitational shockwave that shattered the ice rings of the nearest dead planet. 200 Tartarus-class warships poured out of the rift, their Boeing stellar drives burning like captured stars against the pitch-black canvas of the dead sector. Aboard the Acheron, Commander Fitzpatrick gripped his command console. "Report. We have exited slipspace successfully, Commander," Bowman stated, her fingers dancing across the archaic, physical keyboards of her station. Sensor telemetry is flooding in. The ambient temperature of this sector is near absolute zero, but I'm picking up massive thermal blooms directly beneath the crust of the third rogue planet. "The Harvester shipyards," Fitzpatrick muttered. "Are they active?" "They are now," Ensign Mitchell's voice echoed over the fleet-wide tactical channel from the Vengeance. "Fleet actual, be advised. We have woken the hive." Beneath the icy crust of the rogue planet, the surface began to fracture. Massive fissures, thousands of miles long, glowed with a sickly, bioluminescent green. The ice did not melt. It was violently pulverized as colossal shapes forced their way out of the subterranean depths. The Harvesters. They defied human architectural logic. They were massive, geometric constructs of obsidian-like material, lacking engines, exhaust ports, or any discernible bridge. They moved silently, propelled by localized distortions in space-time, pulling zero-point energy directly from the vacuum. As they breached the planetary crust, they unfolded like predatory insects, revealing internal structures glowing with that same terrifying green circuitry. There were thousands of them, a swarm of exterminators that had slept for 1,000,000 years, waiting for the galaxy to grow loud enough to harvest. "Targeting systems are struggling to lock on," Bowman yelled, sweat stinging her eyes. "Their hulls. They are absorbing our LiDAR and radar pings. It's like trying to target a black hole." "Switch to manual optical tracking," Fitzpatrick barked. "Sync our fire control with the General Atomics autocannons. We don't need a computer to tell us where they are. The sky is full of them." On the Vengeance, Captain Hayes watched the swarm rise to meet them. The Harvesters didn't communicate. They didn't posture. The moment they cleared the planet's gravity well, they opened fire. Their weapons were not plasma or lasers. They fired concentrated beams of exotic dark energy that bypassed standard kinetic shields entirely, tearing directly into the atomic structure of whatever they hit. A Tartarus frigate on the left flank of the human formation was struck first. The green beam intersected its heavily armored hull, and instantly, the metal simply dissolved into a cloud of subatomic ash. The ship didn't explode, it unraveled, taking its crew of 300 into the void in absolute silence. "Evasive maneuvers are useless against energy weapons of that velocity," Hayes said coldly, his face an emotionless mask. "They want to play a game of sheer attrition. Let's show them our hand. Fleet-wide command. Execute Protocol Cerberus. Open all silos." Across the entire human formation, the heavy blast-shielded silos of the Tartarus dreadnoughts cranked open. Fire. It was a barrage that defied comprehension. Tens of thousands of stealth-coated nuclear torpedoes, antimatter warheads, and hypervelocity kinetic slugs were unleashed simultaneously. The sheer recoil of the fleet firing at once pushed the massive ships backward by several kilometers. Space was filled with a blinding, chaotic web of ordnance streaking toward the Harvester swarm. The Harvesters attempted to deploy localized gravitational shields to deflect the barrage, but the sheer volume of human aggression overwhelmed them. The dark space of Sector 44 X-ray erupted in a chain reaction of superheated plasma and nuclear fire. The obsidian hulls of the alien machines, while highly resistant to energy weapons, shattered like glass under the brute force trauma of depleted uranium traveling at a fraction of light speed. Aboard the Acheron, Fitzpatrick felt the deck heave as they unleashed their broadside batteries. Target that cluster of geometric cruisers trying to flank the flagship. Give them the shrapnel canisters. The Acheron rolled, exposing its terrifying broadside gun ports, and unleashed a tidal wave of hypervelocity shrapnel. The jagged metal tore through the alien formation, shredding the delicate glowing green circuitry of the harvesters and causing them to violently detonate. But the aliens were relentless. For every harvester shattered by nuclear fire, 3 more rose from the fractured planet below. They were a machine intellect, devoid of fear or self-preservation. They simply adapted. "Captain!" Reed shouted on the Vengeance, his console sparking as the dreadnought took a grazing hit from a dark energy beam. The harvesters are networking. They are combining their localized zero-point fields into a massive, unified grid. It's a Dyson sphere configuration. They are trying to trap us in a gravity well. Below them, the swarm of thousands of alien ships began to link together, forming a colossal, geometric lattice that glowed with blinding green light. The gravity in the sector instantly spiked. The Acheron groaned, its bulkheads buckling as the artificial gravity well tried to crush the human fleet into a singularity. "Our drives are stalling!" Bowman screamed over the comms. "We can't break the gravitational tether." Hayes stared at the massive, glowing alien lattice. They were trying to crush the human fleet just like the Vengeance had crushed the Blackwood destroyers. "They're drawing all their power from a central node within that lattice," Hayes observed, his eyes narrowing. He turned to his tactical officer, Reed. "It's time. Unseal the Shiva payload." The bridge of the Vengeance went dead silent. Even the stoic helmsman Carter looked back at Hayes, his face pale. "Captain," Reed swallowed hard, "the Shiva payload. The localized singularity. If we detonated inside a gravity well that dense, the resulting spatial collapse won't just destroy the harvesters, it will consume the entire rogue planet. If we are caught in the blast radius." "Then we make sure we aren't," Hayes replied, his voice unyielding. "Route all secondary, tertiary, and life support power to the forward void shields. Carter, plot a ramming course directly down the throat of that central node." "Sir?" Carter asked. "We are going to deliver the bomb by hand," Hayes said. The Vengeance broke from the defensive formation, a lone titan diving into the maw of the glowing green lattice. "Fleet Actual is breaking formation!" Fitzpatrick yelled on the bridge of the Acheron. He watched the telemetry data in horror as Hayes's dreadnought accelerated directly toward the heaviest concentration of harvester fire. "He's making a run on the central node." "Commander," Bowman said frantically, "the Vengeance is routing all power to forward shields. Their aft and flanks are completely exposed. The harvesters are swarming them." Fitzpatrick didn't hesitate. "All ships, this is Commander Fitzpatrick. The Vengeance is making a payload run. Form a wedge around the flagship. Put your hulls between them and the enemy. We do not let the captain fall." The remnants of the Tartarus fleet, piloted by the bitter, vengeful survivors of New Copenhagen, did not retreat. They surged forward. Heavy cruisers like the Acheron flanked the massive dreadnought, physically interposing their heavily armored hulls to block the incoming dark energy beams. Space became a graveyard of human sacrifice. Directorate ships were melted, shattered, and ripped apart by the Harvester swarm, but they refused to break the wedge. They bled so the Vengeance could fly. On the bridge of the flagship, sparks rained down from the ceiling as the ship absorbed unimaginable punishment. "Armor plating on decks 4 through 9 is gone," Henderson screamed from engineering, her voice cracking. "We are taking hull breaches across the port side. I am sealing compartments. But we are bleeding out, Captain." "Keep the main drives burning, Chief," Hayes roared over the deafening cacophony of twisting metal and blaring alarms. "Distance to the central node? 3,000 kilometers and closing," Reed shouted, his hands bleeding as he forced the overloaded tactical console to comply. "The Shiva payload is armed and decoupled from the safety rails, ready for manual deployment." Directly ahead, the Harvester's central node pulsed like a sickly mechanical heart. It was a massive geometric core pulling unimaginable zero-point energy from the fabric of space itself, funneling it into the gravity well that was slowly crushing the human fleet. 1,000 kilometers. Carter gritted his teeth, wrestling with the helm as the gravity shear tried to tear the ship apart. "Captain, we are past the point of no return. We can't break." "Don't break. Punch straight through it," Hayes ordered. The Vengeance, glowing cherry red from thermal friction and trailing plasma from a dozen hull breaches, slammed into the outer defensive ring of the central node. The sheer mass of the human dreadnought shattered the alien constructs like brittle glass. "Deploy payload," Hayes commanded. From the ventral bay of the Vengeance, a sleek, pitch-black cylinder the size of a frigate was ejected. It didn't fire thrusters. It simply drifted, carried by the dreadnought's momentum directly into the glowing green heart of the Harvester lattice. "Hard to port," Hayes yelled. "Burn everything we have left." The Vengeance fired its emergency thrusters, violently throwing the massive ship sideways. The sheer G-force ruptured blood vessels in the crew's eyes, and several officers collapsed as the artificial gravity compensators failed entirely. Behind them, the Shiva payload reached the center of the alien node. The detonation was completely silent. There was no fireball, no blinding flash of light. Instead, space itself seemed to fold inward. A sphere of absolute, perfect darkness erupted from the payload, expanding rapidly. It was a localized singularity, a tear in the fabric of reality that consumed everything it touched. The Harvester central node was instantly ripped apart, its zero-point energy siphoned into the artificial black hole. The massive, glowing lattice of alien ships shrieked a digital acoustic scream of pure mechanical terror as the gravitational pull of the singularity caught them. Thousands of Harvesters were dragged backward, their hulls stretching and spaghettifying before vanishing into the abyss. The singularity did not stop. It consumed the orbital shipyards, tearing chunks of the ice planet's crust into the void, swallowing mountains of rock and alien machinery alike. The Vengeance, flanked by the battered, crippled remnants of the human fleet, burned their drives to the absolute melting point, desperately fighting the pull of the singularity. For agonizing minutes, they hung on the precipice of the event horizon, engines screaming against the gravity of the artificial black hole. And then, with a final, violent shudder, the singularity collapsed in on itself, having consumed all available mass in its immediate vicinity. It vanished, leaving behind only an empty, silent void where the alien armada and the rogue planet had once been. The Harvester threat in Sector 44X-ray was completely eradicated. Aboard the Acheron, Fitzpatrick slowly pulled himself up from the deck, his uniform torn and stained with soot. He looked at the main view screen. The sensor displays were mostly static, but the visual feed showed the Vengeance battered, scorched, missing huge chunks of its hull, but still alive, still howling. "Comms!" Fitzpatrick gasped, his chest aching. "Get me the flagship." Static crackled, and then Captain Hayes's exhausted, gravelly voice filled the bridge. "Commander Fitzpatrick." "Status?" "We're here, Captain," Fitzpatrick breathed, looking around at his surviving crew, who were slowly picking themselves up, staring in awe at the empty space where the alien nightmare had been. "The fleet is heavily damaged. Casualties are high, but the Harvesters are gone. They are gone from this sector," Hayes corrected gently, staring out at the graveyard of dead ships. "But there are more out there. They've been harvesting this galaxy for 1,000,000 years because nothing ever stood up to them." Hayes stood tall on his ruined bridge, the fire of a born predator returning to his eyes. "They woke up to hunt prey," Hayes said, his voice broadcasting across the surviving ships of the human armada. "But they found us instead. Patch the ships, Commander. Reload the silos. Humanity is no longer hiding in the light. We are taking the dark back." The survival of New Copenhagen wasn't a miracle. It was a brutal demonstration of humanity's refusal to die quietly. The UES Vengeance and the ghosts of the Tartarus fleet didn't just save a world, they shattered a 1,000,000-year-old cycle of extinction and proved that when the universe sends monsters, Humanity sends absolute nightmares in return. They walked into the abyss, looked the apex predators of the galaxy in the eye, and burned their house down. If this epic HFY tale of overwhelming firepower, sacrifice, and relentless human grit got your blood pumping, hit that like button to help us push this story out to more sci-fi fans. Share this video with anyone who loves dark, tactical space battles. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter as humanity takes the war to the Harvester's home worlds. Drop a comment below what was your favorite moment of the battle.